his bride, his enemy, his undoing. Alessandra Romano had been raised to be untouchable. But when her father's empire crumbled, she learned how quickly power could be taken. Dario Benedetti circled her like a predator, his voice smooth, knowing. "Your father thought he could cheat me," he murmured. "Now, I own his most precious possession, you." Chapter 1. The Fall of the Romano Empire. The chandelier, a glittering monstrosity of Venetian glass and gold, swayed almost imperceptibly. Alessandra Romano watched it, her reflection fractured in its myriad crystals, a shattered mosaic of what had once been. Just hours ago, this ballroom, usually vibrant with laughter, music, and the clinking of champagne flutes, had echoed with the heavy tread of men who smelled of smoke and old money. Men who had come to collect a debt. Her father, Don Antonio Romano, a man who had once commanded an empire that stretched from the sun-drenched shores of Sicily to the bustling streets of New York, had stood defiant, even as his world crumbled around him. She remembered the tremor in his hand as he'd raised his glass in a final, futile toast, his eyes, usually so full of fire, now clouded with a desperate, haunting fear. A fear she mirrored, but buried deep beneath layers of carefully cultivated composure. Alessandra had been raised in a world of silk and steel, where whispers held more power than shouts, and loyalty was a currency more valuable than gold. She'd learned to read the subtle shifts in her father's moods, the tightening of his jaw when a deal went sour, the barely there smile that meant someone had underestimated him and paid the price. She'd been groomed to be the perfect mafia princess, elegant, intelligent, and above all, untouchable. A prize to be displayed, not possessed. The scent of lilies, her mother's favorite, still clung to the air, a ghostly reminder of a life that had vanished with the setting sun. Her mother, Isabella, had died 5 years ago, a victim of a stray bullet meant for Antonio. The memory of her mother's gentle smile, the warmth of her embrace, was a constant ache in Alessandra's heart, a wound that tonight's events had ripped open anew. The silence of the vast mansion, usually a comforting symphony of hushed conversations and distant laughter, now pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. She ran a hand over the cool, smooth marble of the balustrade overlooking the grand staircase. The marble, imported from Carrara, had been her mother's pride. Now it felt like a cold, unyielding tombstone. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom creaked open, and Dario Benedetti entered. He moved with the predatory grace of a panther, his tailored suit impeccable, his dark hair slicked back, revealing the sharp angles of his face. His eyes, the color of obsidian, found hers across the vast expanse, and a slow, chilling smile curved his lips. Alessandra had met Dario only a handful of times before, at lavish parties and strained business meetings. He was a rising star in the Benedetti family, a rival clan that had, for years, danced a delicate waltz of alliance and animosity with the Romanos. He was known for his ruthlessness, his ambition, and his unnervingly calm demeanor, even in the face of chaos. He was everything her father had taught her to fear, and everything her rebellious heart found inexplicably intriguing. "Alessandra," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of the house. Such a dramatic turn of events. She straightened her spine, refusing to let him see the fear that clawed at her throat. "Dario," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Pleasure? My dear Alessandra, tonight is about business. Unfinished business." He paused, letting his gaze linger on her, a slow, deliberate assessment that made her skin crawl. "Your father, it seems, was not as solvent as he pretended to be." "My father is a man of honor," she retorted, the words echoing hollowly even to her own ears. Dario raised an eyebrow. "Honor? Perhaps. But also, a man of considerable debt. A debt he could not repay." He took a step closer, invading her personal space, the scent of his cologne, a heady mix of sandalwood and something darker, more dangerous, filling her senses. "And what does that have to do with me?" she asked, though a sickening premonition was already taking root in her stomach. His smile widened, revealing a flash of white teeth. "Everything, Kara. Everything." He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a touch that was both possessive and chilling. "Your father offered collateral. A guarantee of repayment." Alessandra's breath hitched. She knew, in that instant, what he was going to say. She had seen the desperation in her father's eyes, the way he'd avoided her gaze all evening, the unspoken fear that had hung heavy in the air. "He offered you." Dario's voice was a silken whisper, a predator's purr. "Your father thought he could cheat me. He gambled and he lost. Now," he leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear, "I own his most precious possession, you." The words struck her like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She wanted to scream, to fight, to claw her way out of this nightmare, but she was frozen, trapped in a cage of gilded promises and broken vows. Her father, the man who had always been her protector, her shield against the world, had sold her, traded her like a piece of property to settle a debt. The chandelier above them seemed to mock her, its shattered reflections a perfect representation of her life, her future, her very soul. Untouchable? She was anything but. She was a pawn in a deadly game, a prize to be claimed, a plaything for a capo. She looked into Dario's eyes, those dark, fathomless pools that promised both danger and a strange, unsettling allure, and saw not a savior, but a captor. A captor who held her fate in his hands. A captor who, she suspected, would show her no mercy. And yet, beneath the fear, beneath the despair, a flicker of something else ignited within her. A spark of defiance. A refusal to be broken. She might be his plaything, but she would not be his victim. She would find a way to survive, to reclaim her life, even if it meant playing his game, learning his rules, and ultimately, turning them against him. The thought, a fragile seed of hope in the barren landscape of her despair, was enough to make her lift her chin, meet his gaze with a newfound steeliness, and whisper, "You may own me, Dario Benedetti, but you will never break me." The air around them crackled with unspoken challenges, a silent battle of wills beginning in the ruins of a fallen empire. The game had begun. Chapter 2. A Cage of Gilded Promises. The drive to the Benedetti estate was a blur of rain-slicked streets and flashing city lights, each reflection a distorted image of Alessandra's fractured reality. Dario remained silent beside her, a brooding presence that filled the luxurious confines of the limousine. His silence was more unsettling than any threat, a constant reminder of her powerlessness. She stared out the window, the city she had known her entire life now seeming foreign and hostile. The Benedetti estate, nestled in the hills overlooking the city, was a fortress of old-world opulence. Wrought iron gates, adorned with the family crest a snarling wolf's had swung open silently, admitting them into a world of manicured gardens, imposing statues, and the ever-present scent of wealth and power. The house itself, a sprawling villa of cream-colored stone, loomed before her, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light that belied the darkness within. As they stepped out of the car, a chill wind whipped around her, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air here felt different, thicker, heavier, charged with an undercurrent of tension she couldn't quite decipher. Servants, their faces carefully neutral, appeared as if from nowhere, whisking away her meager belongings, a single suitcase packed in haste before her father had disappeared. Dario led her through a series of grand hallways, each more lavishly decorated than the last. Paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her every move, judging her, condemning her. The silence was punctuated only by the soft tap of their shoes on the polished marble floors and the distant, muffled sounds of the household going about its business. He stopped before a pair of intricately carved wooden doors. "Your rooms," he announced, his voice devoid of any warmth. He pushed open the doors, revealing a suite of rooms that were both breathtakingly beautiful and utterly suffocating. The bedroom was dominated by a massive four-poster bed draped in heavy silk, the walls adorned with delicate floral wallpaper. A fireplace, unlit, stood cold and empty against one wall. A sitting room adjoined the bedroom, furnished with plush velvet sofas and a delicate writing desk. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the gardens, the city lights twinkling in the distance like fallen stars. It was a cage, albeit a gilded one. A luxurious prison designed to keep her comfortable, compliant, and utterly isolated. "You will be expected to join us for dinner," Dario said, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her reaction. "At 8. Don't be late." He didn't wait for a reply, turning on his heel and leaving her alone in her opulent confinement. The click of the doors closing behind him echoed in the silence, a final, definitive sound that sealed her fate. Alessandra sank onto the edge of the bed, the silk cool against her skin. She felt numb, disoriented, as if she were floating in a dream, waiting for the inevitable moment when she would wake up and find it all a cruel illusion. But the weight of the diamond bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Dario presented with a chillingly possessive smile before they left her father's mansion, was a tangible reminder of her reality. A shackle disguised as a jewel. She walked to the balcony, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the room. The city lights spread out before her, a vast, glittering tapestry that held both beauty and danger. She thought of her father, wondering where he was, what he was thinking, if he felt any remorse for what he had done. A wave of anger, hot and fierce, washed over her. Anger at her father, at Dario, at the circumstances that had brought her to this point. But beneath the anger, a deeper, more profound emotion stirred, a sense of betrayal. Betrayal by the man who had sworn to protect her, betrayal by the world she had thought she knew. She closed her eyes, letting the cool air wash over her face, and made a silent vow. She would not be a victim. She would not allow herself to be consumed by despair. She would learn the rules of this new world, adapt, and find a way to survive. She would use her intelligence, her charm, her very being, to navigate this treacherous landscape and, ultimately, reclaim her freedom. A soft knock on the door startled her. A young woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, entered. She carried a tray laden with a simple meal, a bowl of pasta, a piece of crusty bread, and a glass of water. "Signorina," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Signor Benedetti sent this. He said you might be hungry." Alessandra managed a weak smile. "Thank you." The girl placed the tray on a small table near the window and hesitated, as if wanting to say more. "My name is Sophia," she finally whispered. If you need anything I will," Alessandra assured her, sensing a flicker of kindness in the girl's hesitant demeanor. A potential ally in this hostile environment. Sophia nodded and quickly retreated, leaving Alessandra alone once more. She ate the pasta, the simple flavors a comforting reminder of home, of a life that now seemed a distant memory. As she ate, she began to formulate a plan that was both reckless and necessary. A plan that would require her to walk a tightrope between obedience and defiance, between fear and courage. She would learn everything she could about Dario Benedetti, about his family, his business, his weaknesses. She would use his own arrogance against him, exploit his desire to control her, and ultimately, find a way to escape his grasp. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only hope she had. And as she looked out at the city lights, a new determination hardened her gaze. She would not be broken. She would not be a plaything. She would be the architect of her own destiny. She would survive. And she would, somehow, find a way to make Dario Benedetti regret the day he had dared to claim her as his own. The first sliver of a plan formed around understanding the household dynamic Sophia seemed a weak point, a source of information, and Alessandra resolved to cultivate that connection, no matter how small, as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Shadowed Halls. The following days settled into an unsettling routine. Alessandra remained confined to her rooms, a prisoner in all but name. Meals arrived with silent efficiency, delivered by Sophia, whose initial fear seemed to be slowly giving way to a cautious sympathy. Alessandra made every effort to engage Sophia in conversation, drawing her out with gentle questions about the household, about the Benedetti family, about Dario. Sophia was hesitant at first, her answers brief and guarded, but Alessandra's persistence, coupled with her genuine kindness, began to chip away at the girl's defenses. She learned that the Benedetti estate was a hive of activity, with a constant stream of visitors, some legitimate businessmen, others who carried themselves with the unmistakable air of the underworld. She learned that Dario's mother, Donna Emilia, was the true matriarch of the family, a woman of formidable power and influence, even though she rarely left her private wing of the house. She learned that Dario had two younger brothers, Marco, a hot-headed and impulsive young man who seemed to resent Dario's authority, and Luca, a quiet, studious boy who seemed to have little interest in the family business. Most importantly, she learned that Dario was obsessed with control. He micromanaged every aspect of the household, every detail of the family business, every moment of his own meticulously crafted life. He was a man who demanded absolute obedience, absolute loyalty, and absolute control. And this, Alessandra realized, was his weakness. His need to control everything made him predictable, vulnerable to those who knew how to manipulate his expectations. One evening, as Sophia was clearing away the remnants of Alessandra's dinner, she lingered, her eyes darting nervously towards the door. "Signorina," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, I overheard something. Something about you." Alessandra's heart quickened. "What is it, Sophia?" Sophia hesitated, then took a deep breath. There's talk of a marriage. Signor Benedetti, he intends to marry you." The words hit Alessandra like a physical blow. She had expected this, of course, but to hear it confirmed, to know that her fate was being sealed without her consent, sent a wave of panic through her. Marriage to Dario would mean complete and utter subjugation, the end of any hope of escape. "When?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Soon," Sophia replied. They are making arrangements. Donna Emilia, she approves." Alessandra felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Donna Emilia's approval meant that resistance would be futile. The matriarch's word was law within the Benedetti family. "Thank you, Sophia," she said, forcing a smile. "You've been very kind." Sophia nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. She quickly left the room, leaving Alessandra alone with her thoughts. Marriage. The word echoed in her mind, a death knell to her freedom. She had to act quickly, before it was too late. She needed a plan, a way to escape, a way to fight back. She paced the room, her mind racing. She had no allies, no resources, no one she could trust, except perhaps Sophia, and even that was a fragile, uncertain connection. She was surrounded by enemies, trapped in a web of deceit and power. An idea, desperate and dangerous, began to take shape in her mind. She would use Dario's own obsession with control against him. She would play the part of the obedient, submissive bride, lulling him into a false sense of security. She would learn his secrets, exploit his weaknesses, and then, when the time was right, she would strike. It was a risky plan, a gamble with her very life, but she had nothing left to lose. She would rather die fighting than live as Dario Benedetti's wife. The next morning, Alessandra requested an audience with Dario. She found him in his study, a dimly lit room filled with a scent of leather and old books. He was sitting behind a massive desk, reviewing documents, his face illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Alessandra," he said, his voice neutral. "What is it?" She approached the desk, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had carefully chosen her attire, a simple, elegant dress that emphasized her figure without being overtly provocative. She needed to appear demure, compliant, but also desirable. I wanted to speak to you about our future," she said, her voice carefully modulated, a hint of vulnerability in her tone. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her. "Our future?" he repeated, a hint of amusement in his voice. Yes, she replied, meeting his gaze directly. I understand that you wish to marry me. His smile widened, a slow, predatory curve of his lips. Indeed. And you have objections? No, she said, forcing the word out. No objections. I am honored. His eyebrows rose slightly, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected resistance, defiance, perhaps even tears. He had not expected acceptance. Honored? He repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. Yes, she said, lowering her gaze, feigning shyness. I realize that I am in your debt. That my father, he betrayed you. I wished to make amends. To prove my loyalty. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers, trying to discern any hint of deception. But Alessandra had learned to control her emotions, to mask her true feelings behind a facade of composure. She had learned, from a young age, the art of deception. Finally, he nodded. Very well, he said. I appreciate your cooperation. I wish to be a good wife, she continued, her voice barely a whisper. To make you happy. He stood up and walked around the desk, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his presence overwhelming, his scent filling her senses. He reached out and cupped her chin, forcing her to look up at him. You will learn, Alessandra, he said, his voice a low, husky murmur, that my happiness is your only concern. His words were a threat, a promise, a challenge. And as she looked into his eyes, those dark, fathomless depths that held both danger and a strange, unsettling allure, she knew that she had stepped onto a dangerous path. A path that could lead to either her salvation or her destruction. But there was no turning back. The first phase of her deception was a success, but the true test was only just beginning, and maintaining this fragile facade would be the greatest challenge she had ever faced. A single, wrong word, the wrong expression, she knew it would bring everything crumbling down. Chapter 4. The Weight of Unseen Chains. The days that followed Alessandra's feigned acceptance of her impending marriage were a masterclass in deception. She played the part of the demure, compliant bride-to-be with a skill that surprised even herself. She smiled when expected, spoke softly, and deferred to Dario in all things. She endured his possessive touches, his controlling gestures, his constant scrutiny, all the while reminding herself that this was a performance, a means to an end. She spent hours exploring the vast estate, familiarizing herself with its layout, its routines, its hidden corners. She observed the servants, noting their movements, their conversations, their loyalties. She listened, she learned, she gathered information like a squirrel hoarding nuts for the winter. She continued to cultivate her relationship with Sophia, drawing the girl out with gentle questions and carefully placed confidences. Sophia, increasingly trusting, revealed more about the inner workings of the Benedetti household, about the rivalries and alliances, the secrets and scandals that simmered beneath the surface of opulent respectability. Alessandra learned that Dario's obsession with control stemmed from a deep-seated insecurity, a fear of losing the power he had so ruthlessly acquired. His father, the previous dawn, had been a weak and indecisive man, nearly bringing the family to ruin through his incompetence. Dario had taken over at a young age, seizing control with an iron fist, determined to never repeat his father's mistakes. This knowledge gave Alessandra a glimmer of hope. If she could exploit Dario's insecurities, if she could make him believe that she was completely under his control, she might be able to manipulate him, to turn his own weaknesses against him. One afternoon, while exploring the gardens, she stumbled upon a small, secluded chapel hidden amongst a grove of ancient olive trees. The door was unlocked, and she slipped inside, drawn by a sense of curiosity and a need for solitude. The chapel was small and simple, its walls adorned with faded frescoes depicting scenes from the Bible. A single shaft of sunlight pierced through a stained glass window, illuminating a statue of the Virgin Mary, her face serene and compassionate. Alessandra knelt before the altar, her heart heavy with the weight of her deception, the weight of her unseen chains. She had never been particularly religious, But in this quiet, sacred space, she felt a desperate need for solace, for guidance, for strength. She closed her eyes and prayed, not for divine intervention, but for the courage to continue her charade, the wisdom to make the right choices, the strength to survive. She prayed for a way out, a way to escape the suffocating web of the mafia, a way to reclaim her life. As she prayed, a sense of calm settled over her, a quiet resolve that strengthened her determination. She would not be defeated. She would not be a victim. She would fight for her freedom, even if it meant risking everything. When she emerged from the chapel, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had a plan, a dangerous and desperate plan, but a plan nonetheless. She would use the upcoming wedding preparations to her advantage. She would gather the information she needed, make the contacts she required, and then, when the time was right, she would disappear. She returned to the house, her demeanor calm and composed. She found Dario in the library, poring over documents. He looked up as she entered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice sharp. "I was exploring the gardens," she replied, her voice soft and submissive. "I found a small chapel. It was very peaceful." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "My mother is very devout," he said. "She spends much of her time there." A thought struck Alessandra.
Donna Emilia.
The matriarch. The woman who held the true power within the Benedetti family. If she could somehow gain the Donna's favor, if she could convince her that she was a genuine, loyal addition to the family, it might provide her with an unexpected advantage. "I would like to meet your mother," she said, her voice carefully neutral. I wish to pay my respects." Dario's eyebrows rose slightly. This was unexpected. He had anticipated that Alessandra would avoid his mother, fearing her scrutiny. "Very well," he said. "I will arrange it." He seemed pleased by her request, a subtle indication that her performance was working. He saw her desire to meet his mother as a sign of her growing acceptance of her place within the family, a further indication of his control over her. He had no idea that she was playing him, that every word, every gesture, every smile was a carefully calculated move in a deadly game of chess. And she hoped, would soon be checkmated. As she left the library, she made a conscious effort to seem preoccupied, almost lost in thought, to further reinforce the image of a woman slowly succumbing to the inevitable. The meeting with Donna Emilia was a risk, but one she had to take. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Forgotten Life. The meeting with Donna Emilia was arranged for the following afternoon. Alessandra spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, carefully planning her approach. She knew that this encounter could be crucial to her plan, a chance to gain an ally, or at least to avoid making a powerful enemy. She chose a simple, elegant dress in a muted shade of blue, a color she knew Donna Emilia favored. She wore minimal jewelry, only a delicate silver cross that had belonged to her mother, a subtle reminder of her own past, a symbol of hope and resilience. Sophia, sensing Alessandra's anxiety, offered words of encouragement. "Donna Emilia is strict," she whispered, "but she is also fair. She values honesty and loyalty above all else." "Thank you, Sophia," Alessandra replied, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. "You've been a true friend." Sophia blushed, her eyes shining with a mixture of pleasure and surprise. It was clear that the girl had formed a genuine attachment to Alessandra, a bond that transcended their different social standings. At the appointed hour, Alessandra was escorted to Donna Emilia's private wing of the house. The air here was noticeably cooler, the silence deeper, more profound. The rooms were decorated in a more traditional style, with heavy, dark furniture, antique tapestries, and religious icons. Donna Emilia was seated in a high-backed chair near a window, her frail figure draped in a black shawl. Her face, though lined with age, was still strikingly beautiful, her eyes sharp and intelligent, her expression one of quiet authority. She reminded Alessandra, in a way that made her breath catch, of her own mother. A gentler time, a simpler one, an ache of loss stabbed through her performance for a fleeting second. "Signora Benedetti," Alessandra said, curtsying respectfully. "It is an honor to meet you." Donna Emilia studied her for a long moment, her gaze intense and unwavering. "Alessandra," she said, her voice surprisingly strong, despite a slight tremor. "You are different from what I expected." Alessandra's heart skipped a beat. Had she miscalculated? Had Donna Emilia seen through her deception? "Different, Signora?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes," Donna Emilia replied. "Your father, he was a man of questionable character." I had expected a certain, shall we say, defiance. Alessandra lowered her gaze, feigning humility. "My father, he made mistakes," she said softly. "But I am not my father. I wish only to serve the Benedetti family, to be a good wife to Dario." Donna Emilia continued to study her, her eyes searching, probing. Then, a flicker of something approval perhaps appeared in her gaze. "You speak well, child," she said. "But words are cheap. Actions speak louder." "I understand, Signora," Alessandra replied. "I will strive to prove my loyalty through my actions."
Donna Emilia nodded slowly.
"Dario, he is a strong man, but he is also vulnerable. He has been hurt in the past. He needs a woman who will stand by him, who will support him, who will understand him." Alessandra sensed an opportunity. "I believe I can be that woman, Signora," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. I understand the weight of responsibility, the burden of leadership." Donna Emilia's eyes narrowed slightly. "You do?" Alessandra took a deep breath, drawing on her own experiences, her own losses, her own fears. "My mother, she died when I was young," she said softly. "I saw the toll it took on my father, the loneliness, the constant pressure." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Then, she looked directly at Donna Emilia, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I believe I can ease Dario's burden. I can be his strength." Donna Emilia was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on Alessandra's face. Then she gave a slight nod. "Perhaps," she said. "Perhaps you can." The conversation continued for another hour, ranging from discussions of family history to the details of the upcoming wedding. Alessandra was careful to be respectful, deferential, but also to subtly assert her own intelligence and her own strength of character. By the time the meeting ended, Alessandra felt a cautious optimism. She had not won Donna Emilia over completely, but she had made a positive impression. She had planted a seed of trust, a seed that might, with careful nurturing, blossom into a valuable alliance. As she was leaving, Donna Emilia called her back. "Alessandra," she said, her voice low and intimate. "Dario, he can be difficult, but he has a good heart beneath the harsh exterior." "I understand, Signora," Alessandra replied, meeting her gaze directly. "Protect him," Donna Emilia whispered, her eyes filled with a mixture of warning and pleading. "Protect him from himself." The words resonated with Alessandra, a strange and unexpected echo of her own feelings. She had seen glimpses of vulnerability beneath Dario's carefully constructed facade, hints of a man haunted by his past, burdened by his responsibilities. She left Donna Emilia's rooms with a renewed sense of determination. She would continue her deception, she would continue her plan to escape, but she would also try to understand Dario.
To see the man beneath the mask.
To perhaps even help him. It was a dangerous game, a delicate balance between self-preservation and a growing, unsettling empathy for her captor. But as she walked back to her rooms, she knew that she could not ignore the echoes of a forgotten life, the whispers of compassion that were beginning to stir within her. The meeting had gone better than she could have ever dared to hope. It was a significant step, but now the truly difficult work of weaving herself into the fabric of the Benedetti family began, and she couldn't afford a single misstep. She needed to gather further information. To plan her escape, Donna Emilia's words were a small crack of light in a dark, formidable wall. Chapter 6. The Devil's Bargain. The preparations for the wedding accelerated, transforming the Benedetti estate into a whirlwind of activity. Dressmakers, florists, caterers, and musicians swarmed the house, their presence a constant reminder of Alessandra's impending fate. She moved through it all like a ghost, observing, planning, waiting for her opportunity. Dario, increasingly preoccupied with the details of the wedding and the ongoing business of the family, seemed to take Alessandra's compliance for granted. He treated her with a possessive affection, showering her with expensive gifts, showcasing her to his associates as a prized trophy. He seemed oblivious to the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. One evening, Dario announced that he was hosting a small dinner party for some of his closest associates. He instructed Alessandra to be present, to be charming, to be the perfect mafia bride. It was a test, she knew, a chance for him to show off his control over her, to demonstrate her loyalty to his allies. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep crimson silk that accentuated her figure and highlighted her dark hair and eyes. She wore the diamond bracelet Dario had given her, the weight of it a constant reminder of her captivity. She looked in the mirror, seeing not her own reflection, but the image of the woman Dario wanted her to be, beautiful, obedient, and utterly under his control. The dinner party was a lavish affair, held in the grand dining room, the table laden with exquisite food and expensive wine. The guests, a mix of powerful men and their elegantly dressed wives, were a study in contrasts, some charming and sophisticated, others cold and calculating. Alessandra navigated the social minefield with practiced ease, smiling, making polite conversation, playing the role of the dutiful fiancé. She noticed, however, that one of the guests, a man named Sal DeMarco, seemed to be watching her with particular interest. DeMarco was a senior member of a rival family, a man known for his ruthlessness and his ambition. He was older than Dario, with a weathered face and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see through her carefully constructed facade. During a lull in the conversation, DeMarco approached her. "Signorina Romano," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "You are a vision." "Thank you, Signor DeMarco," she replied, her voice carefully neutral. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips. "Dario is a lucky man," he said, "to have found such a beautiful and compliant bride." Alessandra felt a flicker of unease. His words were too pointed, his gaze too knowing. He was testing her, probing for weaknesses. "I am honored to be marrying into the Benedetti family," she replied, maintaining her composure. He chuckled softly. "Honor? Or obligation?" Alessandra's heart skipped a beat. He knew. Somehow he knew. I don't understand," she said, feigning innocence. He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Don't play coy with me, Signorina," he whispered. "I know about your father's debts. I know about the arrangement." Alessandra felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Her secret was out. Her carefully constructed deception was crumbling. She began, but he cut her off. "I can help you," he said, his voice a low, seductive murmur. Alessandra's eyes widened in surprise. "Help me?" "Yes," he replied. "I can offer you a way out." He was offering her a devil's bargain. A chance to escape Dario. But at what cost? She knew that DeMarco was not motivated by altruism. He had his own agenda, his own reasons for wanting to help her. What would he want in return? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Information," he said. "Information about the Benedetti family. About their business. About their weaknesses." He was asking her to betray Dario, to betray the family she was about to marry into. It was a dangerous game, a betrayal that could have deadly consequences. But it was also her only chance, perhaps her last chance, to escape. She hesitated, weighing her options. On the one hand, she could refuse DeMarco's offer and remain trapped in a loveless marriage, a prisoner of Dario's control. On the other hand, she could accept his offer and risk everything, betraying Dario and facing the wrath of the Benedetti family. The decision was agonizing, the stakes impossibly high. But as she looked into DeMarco's eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that saw through her pretense, she knew that she had no choice. She was already playing a dangerous game. She might as well play to win. I accept," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. DeMarco's smile widened. "Good," he said. "Very good. We'll talk later." in private. He gave her a subtle nod and moved away, leaving her standing there, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She had made a deal with the devil, a bargain that could either save her or destroy her. But she had made her choice, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. The weight of the decision, the potential consequences, threatened to crush her, but she steeled herself. This was it. There was no turning back now. She caught a glimpse of Dario across the room. He was watching her, a possessive gleam in his eyes. He had no idea of the storm that had just been unleashed. Chapter 7. Scars Beneath the Surface. The clandestine meetings with Sal DeMarco became Alessandra's lifeline, a dangerous and exhilarating dance on the edge of a precipice. They met in secret, in the dead of night, in the hidden corners of the estate, the abandoned greenhouse, the dusty library attic, the secluded chapel where she had once sought solace. DeMarco was a shrewd and demanding taskmaster, pressing Alessandra for every detail she could glean about the Benedetti family's operations. He wanted to know about their alliances, their rivalries, their smuggling routes, their financial dealings, their vulnerabilities. He was like a spider, patiently weaving a web of information, waiting to ensnare his prey. Alessandra, in turn, became a master spy, her senses heightened, her mind sharp and alert. She listened, she observed, she pieced together the fragments of information she gathered from Sofia, from overheard conversations, from carefully placed questions to Dario and his brothers. She discovered that the Benedetti family was involved in a complex and dangerous power struggle with several other mafia families, including DeMarco's. She learned about their illicit businesses, their hidden bank accounts, their network of corrupt officials. She uncovered secrets that could bring the entire empire crashing down. But as she delved deeper into the dark underbelly of the mafia world, she also began to see a different side of Dario. She witnessed his ruthless efficiency, his unwavering loyalty to his family, his surprising moments of vulnerability. One night, during a particularly tense meeting with DeMarco, Alessandra found herself defending Dario, almost instinctively. DeMarco had made a disparaging remark about Dario's leadership, calling him a weak, insecure boy playing at being a man. "He's not weak," Alessandra retorted, her voice sharp with unexpected anger. "He's complex. He's carrying the weight of his family's legacy on his shoulders. He's trying to do what he thinks is right." DeMarco raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You seem to be developing a fondness for your captor, Signorina," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. Alessandra flushed, realizing that she had revealed too much. "I'm simply stating the facts," she said, regaining her composure. DeMarco chuckled softly. "Be careful, Signorina," he warned. "Don't let your emotions cloud your judgment. This is a dangerous game we're playing. There's no room for sentimentality." His words struck a chord, reminding her of the precariousness of her situation. She was walking a tightrope, balancing between her desire for freedom and a growing, unsettling empathy for Dario. Later that week, Alessandra had an unexpected encounter with Dario that further complicated her feelings. She found him in his study, late at night, staring out the window at the city lights. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, his usual air of confidence replaced by a weary resignation. "Dario?" she said softly, entering the room. He turned, startled by her presence. "Alessandra," he said, his voice rough. "What are you doing here?" I couldn't sleep," she replied. "I saw the light on." He gestured for her to sit, and she perched on the edge of a chair opposite him. An uncomfortable silence filled the room, punctuated only by the ticking of an antique clock. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Just business," he said evasively. "Complications." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Is it the DeMarco family?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. His eyes widened in surprise. "How did you?" She shrugged. "I overhear things," she said. "Sofia, she talks." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. Then he gave a slight nod. "DeMarco is a problem," he admitted. "He's ambitious. He wants what we have. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and vulnerability. "I don't want you involved in this, Alessandra," he said, his voice low and earnest. "It's dangerous." His words, a strange mixture of protectiveness and possessiveness, touched her in an unexpected way. She saw, for the first time, the burden he carried, the loneliness of his position, the constant pressure he was under. "I understand," she said softly. He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You're different from what I expected," he said, his voice husky. "You're stronger, more resilient." His words were a mirror image of what Donna Emilia had said to her. It was as if, beneath the layers of deception and mistrust, they were beginning to see each other, to understand each other. He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers. He began, then hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. Alessandra's heart quickened. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of emotion that transcended his usual guarded demeanor. A spark of something more. Was it possible? Could he actually be developing genuine feelings for her? He gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingertips lingering on her skin. The touch sent a shiver down her spine, a confusing mix of fear and desire. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent a jolt of electricity through her. It was a kiss that held both a question and a promise, a kiss that blurred the lines between captor and captive, between enemy and something more. The kiss shattered the carefully constructed walls she had built, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She knew she should pull away, that this was dangerous, that it complicated everything, but she couldn't. For a moment, she allowed herself to respond, to feel, to forget the game they were playing. Then the reality of her betrayal flooded back, a cold wave of guilt washing over her. Chapter 8. A glimmer of defiance. The kiss, brief and tentative as it was, marked a turning point in Alessandra's relationship with Dario. It shattered the carefully constructed facade she had maintained, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She found herself increasingly torn between her desire for freedom and a growing, unsettling attraction to her captor. Dario, too, seemed affected by the encounter. He became more attentive, more considerate, his possessiveness tempered by a newfound tenderness. He sought her out more often, engaging her in conversations that went beyond the superficial, revealing glimpses of his hopes, his fears, his dreams. Alessandra, however, could not afford to let her guard down. She knew that Dario was still a dangerous man, a man capable of ruthless violence, a man who would not hesitate to destroy her if he discovered her betrayal. She continued her clandestine meetings with DeMarco, feeding him information, playing her dangerous game. One evening, Dario invited Alessandra to accompany him on a visit to a local orphanage, a charitable institution that the Benedetti family had supported for generations. He explained that it was important for her, as his future wife, to be seen as a benevolent figure, a patron of the community. Alessandra agreed, seeing it as another opportunity to gather information, to observe Dario in a different setting. She was surprised, however, by what she witnessed at the orphanage. Dario, usually so cold and aloof, interacted with the children with a genuine warmth and kindness that astonished her. He played games with them, read them stories, listened to their concerns with a patience and understanding that she had never seen before. He seemed to genuinely care about their welfare, their future. Alessandra saw a different side of Dario that day, a side that was both compassionate and vulnerable. She saw the man he could have been, the man he might still be, if he were not trapped by the legacy of his family, by the brutal realities of the mafia world. As they were leaving the orphanage, Dario turned to Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and something else. Something that looked like hope. They need someone to look up to, he said, his voice soft. Someone to show them that there is a different way. Alessandra nodded, her heart aching with a confusing mix of emotions. She saw, in that moment, a glimmer of redemption, a possibility of change, a chance for Dario to break free from the darkness that surrounded him. But she also knew that it was a fragile hope, a dream that could easily be shattered by the harsh realities of their world. She was still playing a dangerous game, still betraying him, still plotting her escape. Later that night, Alessandra met with DeMarco in the abandoned greenhouse. He was impatient, demanding more information, pressing her for details about an upcoming shipment of illicit goods. Alessandra hesitated, her conscience nagging at her. She had seen a different side of Dario, a side that made her question her actions, her motives, her entire plan. I don't know, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm not sure I can do this anymore. DeMarco's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. What are you saying? He demanded. You made a deal, Signorina. You can't back out now. But he's not all bad, she stammered, struggling to articulate her conflicted feelings. DeMarco laughed, a harsh, cynical sound. Don't be naive, Signorina, he said. He's a Benedetti. He's a killer. He's a criminal. He'll never change. His words struck her like a slap in the face, reminding her of the brutal reality of Dario's world. She was caught in a web of her own making, trapped between her desire for freedom and a growing, unsettling compassion for her captor. I need more time, she pleaded. Just give me a few more days. DeMarco studied her for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he gave a slight nod. Very well, he said. But don't disappoint me, Signorina, or you'll regret it. He turned and left, leaving Alessandra alone in the darkness, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. She had bought herself a little more time, but she knew that she was running out of options. She had to make a choice that would determine not only her own fate, but also the fate of Dario Benedetti. She returned to her rooms, her mind racing. She looked out the window at the city lights, the same lights that had once seemed so distant, so unattainable. Now they seemed to mock her, to remind her of the freedom she craved, the freedom that was still just out of reach. A flicker of the old defiance returned. She wouldn't give up. She wouldn't let DeMarco, or Dario, or anyone, dictate her future. She needed a new plan, one that didn't involve betraying the man she was starting to care for. It was a long shot, but she had to try. She owed it to herself, and perhaps she owed it to Dario, too. Chapter 9. The Serpent's Charm. Alessandra's internal conflict intensified, pulling her in opposing directions. The growing empathy for Dario clashed violently with the urgent need to escape the gilded cage of the Benedetti family. DeMarco's constant pressure added fuel to the fire, his veiled threats a stark reminder of the dangers she faced. She decided to take a calculated risk, attempting to subtly dissuade Dario from the upcoming shipment that DeMarco was so keen on intercepting. She knew it was a dangerous maneuver, one that could expose her deception, but she felt compelled to act, to try and prevent bloodshed, to perhaps even save Dario from himself. One evening, during a quiet dinner, Alessandra steered the conversation towards the family business, feigning a naive curiosity. Dario, she said softly, this shipment. Sophia told me it's important. Dario looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. It is, he replied, his voice guarded. A significant deal. Is it dangerous? She asked, her voice laced with a carefully crafted hint of concern. He hesitated, then gave a slight nod. There are risks, he admitted. Always risks. Perhaps it could be postponed? She suggested, her voice barely a whisper. Until after the wedding? He studied her for a long moment, his gaze intense and searching. He was trying to discern her motives, to see if she was simply expressing wifely concern or if there was something more behind her words.
Why?
He asked, his voice sharp. She lowered her gaze, feigning shyness. I worry about you, she said softly. I don't want anything to happen to you. He reached out and took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. Nothing will happen to me, Alessandra, he said, his voice reassuring. I promise you. But his words did little to ease her anxiety. She knew that he was underestimating the threat, that DeMarco was planning something that could have devastating consequences. She tried again, a different approach this time. I overheard some of the men talking, she said, her voice hesitant. They seemed worried. About DeMarco. Dario's expression hardened. DeMarco is a snake, he said, his voice filled with contempt. He's always looking for an opportunity to undermine us. Perhaps it would be wise to be cautious, she suggested. To strengthen security. He looked at her, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. Are you suggesting I'm not being cautious enough? He asked, his voice edged with anger. Alessandra quickly backpedaled, realizing that she had pushed too far. No, of course not, she said, her voice apologetic.
Justivori.
He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I appreciate your concern, Alessandra, he said, his voice softening. But I know what I'm doing. I won't let DeMarco win. His words were a mixture of reassurance and stubborn pride. She knew that she had failed to dissuade him, that he was determined to proceed with the shipment, regardless of the risks. Later that night, Alessandra met with DeMarco in the library attic. He was furious, sensing her hesitation, her reluctance to provide him with the information he needed. What's wrong, Signorina? He demanded, his voice harsh. You're losing your nerve? I'm trying to help you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But I don't want anyone to get hurt. DeMarco laughed, a cynical, mocking sound. Hurt, he repeated. This is the mafia, Signorina. People get hurt. That's the way it works. But there has to be another way, she pleaded. A way to avoid bloodshed. DeMarco's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. There is no other way, he said. You made a deal, Signorina. You either give me the information I need, or you face the consequences. His threat hung in the air, heavy and menacing. Alessandra knew that she was trapped, that she had no choice but to continue playing his game. But she was also determined to find a way to mitigate the damage, to protect Dario, even if it meant risking her own life. She gave DeMarco the information he wanted, the details of the shipment, the time, the location, the security arrangements. But as she spoke, a new plan began to form in her mind, a desperate gamble that could either save them all or destroy them completely. She would use DeMarco's information against him, warn Dario in a way that wouldn't implicate her, and hopefully prevent a bloodbath. It was a long shot, a dangerous and reckless plan, but it was the only option she had left. The serpent's charm had ensnared her, but she was determined to break free, even if it meant facing the serpent's wrath. Chapter 10. Unveiling the Mask. Alessandra's plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. She decided to anonymously warn Dario about DeMarco's planned ambush, using a method that wouldn't directly implicate her. She knew that if Dario discovered her betrayal, her life would be forfeit. But the thought of innocent lives being lost, including Dario's, spurred her on. She spent a sleepless night crafting a carefully worded note, detailing DeMarco's plot without revealing her source. She used a typewriter she found in the dusty library attic, ensuring there would be no trace of her handwriting. She wrote in simple, direct language, mimicking the style of a low-level informant, someone who might have overheard DeMarco's plans. The note read, Benedetti DeMarco plans ambush.
Shipment.
Date, time, location.
Be warned.
Friend. The next morning, under the pretense of visiting the chapel for prayer, Alessandra slipped the note into a small, unmarked envelope. She then sought out Marco, Dario's hot-headed younger brother, knowing he often felt overlooked and resentful of Dario's authority. Marco, eager to prove himself, would likely act on the information without questioning its source too closely, hoping to gain an advantage over his brother. She found Marco in the stables, tending to his horse. He looked up as she approached, his expression one of guarded curiosity. Signorina Alessandra, he said, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. To what do I owe the pleasure? Alessandra forced a smile. Marco, she said, her voice soft and friendly. I need your help. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. My help? With what? She held out the envelope. I found this, she said, her voice hesitant. Near the gate. I think it might be important. Marco took the envelope, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. What is it? I don't know, she replied, feigning ignorance. I didn't open it. But it looks urgent. Marco hesitated, then tore open the envelope and scanned the note. His eyes widened in surprise, then hardened with anger. DeMarco, he muttered, his voice filled with contempt. The treacherous bastard. Alessandra held her breath, watching him closely. He seemed to believe the note, to accept it as genuine. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. Marco looked at her, a flicker of calculation in his eyes. I'm going to tell Dario, he said. And we're going to be ready for him. He gave her a curt nod and strode away, leaving Alessandra alone with her racing heart. She had planted the seed, set her plan in motion. Now, all she could do was wait and pray that it worked. Later that day, the estate was abuzz with activity. Alessandra watched from her window as armed men gathered. Vehicles were prepared, and Dario, his face grim and determined, issued orders. He looked different. More focused, more dangerous, more alive. She felt a pang of guilt, knowing that she had orchestrated this, that she had put him in harm's way. But she also felt a sense of pride. She had given him a fighting chance, a chance to protect his family, his legacy. As night fell, Alessandra found herself drawn to Dario's study. She knocked softly on the door, and he called for her to enter. He was standing by the window, staring out at the darkness, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as she entered, his eyes searching hers. Alessandra, he said, his voice low. You should be resting. I couldn't sleep, she replied. I wanted to see if you were all right. He gave a slight smile, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. I'm fine, he said. Thanks to a well-timed warning. Alessandra's heart skipped a beat. He knew. Somehow he knew. Warning? She asked, feigning innocence. He stepped closer, his gaze intense and unwavering. Don't play coy with me, Alessandra, he said, his voice soft but firm. I know it was you. She felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Her deception was over. Her plan had failed. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, but her voice betrayed her. He reached out and gently cupped her chin, forcing her to look up at him. I know you, Alessandra, he said, his voice husky. I see you. I see the fire in your eyes, the strength in your spirit, the compassion in your heart. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of fear, of guilt, of relief. He knew, and yet he wasn't angry.
Why?
He asked, his voice filled with a mixture of confusion and admiration. Why did you do it? She took a deep breath, steeling herself for the inevitable. Because I couldn't let them hurt you, she whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't let them win. He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then, he pulled her into his arms, holding her close, his embrace both protective and possessive. You risked your life for me, he said, his voice rough with emotion.
Why?
She buried her face in his chest, her tears soaking his shirt. Because she began, then hesitated, unable to articulate the complex emotions that surged through her. He tilted her chin up, forcing her to meet his gaze. Because? He prompted, his eyes filled with a question, a hope, a demand. And in that moment, Alessandra knew. She couldn't deny it any longer. She had fallen in love with her captor, with the man she had sworn to betray. Because I love you, Dario, she whispered, the words a confession, a surrender, a plea. The mask was gone. The truth was out. And the consequences, whatever they may be, were now unavoidable. Chapter 11. Torn between duty and desire. Alessandra's confession hung in the air, a fragile bridge between two warring worlds. Dario's arms tightened around her, his embrace a mixture of possessiveness and disbelief. He stared into her eyes, searching for any trace of deception, any hint that her words were another carefully crafted lie. But he found only truth, raw and vulnerable, staring back at him. You love me? He whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He seemed unable to comprehend the words, as if they were a foreign language he was struggling to decipher. Alessandra nodded, tears streaming down her face. I do, she affirmed, her voice trembling but resolute. I know it's wrong. I know it's impossible. But I can't deny it any longer. He released a shaky breath, his grip on her softening. He looked lost, confused, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The woman he had thought he owned, the woman he had believed to be compliant and submissive, had just revealed a depth of feeling, a capacity for defiance that he had never anticipated. "But DeMarco," he said, his voice a low murmur, "the note you betrayed me." "I did," she admitted, her voice filled with guilt. "But I also saved you. I couldn't let him hurt you." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching hers. "You were playing both sides," he said, his voice a mixture of accusation and understanding. "I was trying to survive," she whispered. "I was trying to find a way out. But I couldn't let you die." He was silent for a long moment, his mind struggling to reconcile the conflicting realities. He had been betrayed, manipulated, deceived. And yet he had also been saved, protected, loved.
"Why?"
he asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Why would you risk your life for me? After everything I've done, after everything I've put you through?" Alessandra looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and compassion. "Because I saw the man beneath the mask," she said softly. "I saw your pain, your loneliness, your goodness." She reached out and gently touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the lines of his face. "You're not the monster everyone believes you to be, Dario," she said. "You're a man trapped by his circumstances. A man desperate for love." His eyes softened, a flicker of vulnerability appearing in their depths. He leaned into her touch, his defenses crumbling, his carefully constructed facade melting away. "And you can see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yes," she replied. "I can." He pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair, his body trembling with emotion. I don't know what to do," he confessed, his voice a muffled plea. "Just hold me," she whispered, her arms wrapping around him, offering comfort, offering solace, offering love. They stood there for a long time, locked in an embrace that was both desperate and tender, a refuge from the storm that raged around them. The world outside, the world of mafia rivalries, of power struggles, of violence and betrayal, seemed to fade away, replaced by the simple, profound connection between two souls. But the reality of their situation could not be ignored forever. Dario was still the capo of the Benedetti family, bound by duty, by tradition, by the expectations of his world. Alessandra was still his captive, his promised bride, a pawn in a deadly game. Dario pulled back slightly, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and conflict. I love you too, Alessandra," he confessed, his voice raw with emotion. I never thought it was possible. But I do." His words were a balm to her soul, a validation of her feelings, a promise of something more. But they were also a source of fear, a reminder of the impossible chasm that separated them. "But what do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. We can't just ignore everything." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. I need time to think." He stepped away from her, his body tense, his mind racing. He paced the room, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, of duty and desire, of loyalty and love. He was torn between the world he knew, the world he was bound to, and the woman who had shown him a glimpse of a different life, a different future. The night stretched on, filled with an uneasy silence, a palpable tension. Alessandra watched him, her heart aching for him, her own future hanging precariously in the balance. She had confessed her love, risked everything, and now she could only wait. She had laid bare her soul, and his decision would dictate everything that followed. The choice was his. She had none left. Chapter 12. The Price of Loyalty. The dawn brought with it a chilling clarity, a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation. Dario remained distant, his mind clearly wrestling with the impossible choice before him. He had declared his love for Alessandra, but the weight of his responsibilities, the ingrained code of the mafia, loomed large. He summoned his brothers, Marco and Luca, to his study. Alessandra, though excluded from the meeting, could sense the tension emanating from the room, the hushed voices, the occasional outburst of anger. She knew that Dario was facing a monumental decision, one that would determine not only their future but also the fate of the Benedetti family. After several hours, the doors to the study opened, and Dario emerged, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and resignation. Marco and Luca followed, their expressions grim. Dario looked at Alessandra, his gaze unwavering. "I've made a decision," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Alessandra's heart pounded in her chest, her breath caught in her throat. She braced herself for the inevitable, for the crushing blow that would shatter her dreams, her hopes, her love. I am going to marry you, Alessandra, he said, his words a stark pronouncement, a decree that sealed her fate. Relief washed over her, a wave of unexpected joy that made her knees weak. He had chosen her. He had chosen love over duty, over tradition, over everything. But her relief was short-lived. Dario continued, his voice hardening, his expression turning cold. "But it will be a marriage in name only," he said.
A stratégique alliance.
"A way to consolidate my power." Alessandra's heart sank. He was choosing her, but not for the reasons she had hoped. He was still trapped by his world, still bound by the code of the mafia. He was offering her a gilded cage, a life of luxury and privilege, but without love, without genuine connection, without freedom. What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I mean," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, "that you will be my wife, the mother of my children, the mistress of my house. But you will not be my lover. You will not be mine." His words were a cruel blow, a rejection that cut deeper than any physical wound. He was offering her a life of servitude, a life of emptiness, a life devoid of the love she craved. "But you said you loved me," she whispered, her voice filled with pain. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I do," he admitted, his voice a low murmur. "But I cannot betray my family. I cannot abandon my responsibilities." "So you're choosing them over me?" she asked, her voice choked with emotion. He closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. "I'm choosing what I must," he said. "What is expected of me?" Alessandra felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, rising within her. He was a coward, hiding behind his duty, his tradition, his fear. He was choosing a life of empty power over a life of genuine love. "Then you are not the man I thought you were," she said, her voice cold and resolute. His eyes snapped open, a flicker of surprise, of hurt, appearing in their depths. He had expected tears, pleas, perhaps even a desperate attempt to change his mind. He had not expected defiance. "Alessandra," he began, but she cut him off. "I will marry you, Dario," she said, her voice unwavering. "I will fulfill my obligations. But I will never be yours. Not in the way you want. Not in the way I deserve." She turned and walked away, her head held high, her back straight, her heart shattered but her spirit unbroken. She would play the part, fulfill her duty, but she would never surrender her soul. She would never be truly his. As she walked away, she heard him call her name, a desperate plea filled with regret and longing. But she did not turn back. She had made her choice, just as he had made his. And the price of loyalty, the price of love, would be paid by them both. The marriage would proceed, but it would be a hollow shell, a constant reminder of what could have been and what would never be. The chasm between them remained, bridged only by a fragile, broken promise. Chapter 13. Secrets in the Dark. The wedding took place under a cloud of unspoken tension, a lavish spectacle masking the deep chasm between bride and groom. Alessandra moved through the ceremony like a porcelain doll, beautiful and lifeless, her smiles forced, her eyes devoid of joy. Dario, equally stoic, performed his role with a chilling detachment, his gaze rarely meeting hers. The guests, oblivious to the underlying drama, celebrated the union of two powerful families, unaware of the silent battle raging beneath the surface of opulent respectability. Only Donna Emilia, with her sharp, knowing eyes, seemed to sense the turmoil, her gaze lingering on Alessandra with a mixture of pity and understanding. After the ceremony, Alessandra found herself alone in the vast, opulent bedroom that was now hers. She removed the elaborate wedding gown, the heavy jewels, the suffocating veil, feeling a sense of relief as she shed the symbols of her gilded cage. She changed into a simple silk robe, a color of deep midnight blue, and walked to the balcony, seeking solace in the cool night air. The city lights spread out before her, a vast, glittering tapestry that held both beauty and danger. She thought of her father, of her mother, of the life she had lost, the future she had dreamed of. She thought of Dario, of the love she had felt, the hope she had harbored, the bitter disappointment that now consumed her. A soft knock on the door startled her. She turned, expecting Sophia, but it was Luca, Dario's youngest brother, who stood hesitantly in the doorway. "Alessandra?" he said, his voice soft and uncertain. Can I talk to you?" Luca had always been kind to her, a gentle soul trapped in the brutal world of the mafia. He had shown her a quiet respect, a genuine empathy that was rare within the Benedetti family. "Of course, Luca," she replied, gesturing for him to enter. He stepped inside, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and sadness. He looked younger than his years, his shoulders slumped, his expression one of quiet resignation. "I know things aren't what they seem," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know about you and Dario." Alessandra's heart skipped a beat. How much did he know? Had Dario confided in him? What do you know?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I know that he loves you," he said softly. "And I know that you love him." He paused, then took a deep breath. "I also know that he's hurting you, that he's making a mistake." Alessandra was surprised by his words, by his willingness to speak out against his brother, against the family code. Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a genuine compassion. "Because I believe in love," he said softly. "I believe that it's the only thing that matters. And I don't want to see you suffer." His words touched her deeply, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that surrounded her. She saw, in Luca, an unexpected ally, a kindred spirit, a potential source of support. "Thank you, Luca," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "Your words mean a lot to me." He smiled, a shy, tentative smile that lit up his face. "I also wanted to tell you something else," he said, his voice hesitant. "Something about Dario." Chapter 14. A Dance with Danger. Luca hesitated, his gaze darting nervously towards the door, as if expecting someone to overhear their conversation. He lowered his voice, drawing closer to Alessandra. There's something you should know about Dario," he whispered. "Something about his past. Something that explains a lot." Alessandra's heart quickened. She had always sensed a hidden darkness in Dario, a deep-seated pain that fueled his ruthlessness, his control, his fear. "What is it, Luca?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Luca took a deep breath, steeling himself for the revelation. "Years ago," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "when Dario was just a young man, he was in love. Deeply in love." Alessandra felt a pang of jealousy, a sharp, unexpected pain that surprised her. She had known, of course, that Dario must have had relationships in the past, but to hear about a deep love, a love that had clearly left its mark on him, stirred a complex mix of emotions within her. "Her name was Isabella," Luca continued, his voice filled with sadness. "She was beautiful,
Kind.
gentle, everything that Dario wasn't." He paused, his gaze fixed on a distant point, as if lost in the memory. They were inseparable. They were going to be married. Alessandra felt a growing sense of dread, a premonition of tragedy. She knew, instinctively, that this story would not have a happy ending. What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Luca's eyes filled with tears. "She was killed," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Caught in the crossfire of a rival family's attack. An attack meant for Dario." Alessandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The horror of the story, the sheer brutality of it, struck her like a physical blow. She understood, now, The source of Dario's pain, his fear, his obsession with control. He had lost the woman he loved, lost her because of who he was, because of the world he inhabited. It had broke him. Luca continued, his voice barely audible. He blamed himself. He vowed never to love again, never to be vulnerable again. He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and pleading. He's afraid, Alessandra, he said softly. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of being hurt again. Alessandra felt a wave of compassion wash over her, a deep understanding of Dario's actions, his choices, his cruelty. He was not a monster, but a man deeply wounded, a man trapped by his past, a man desperately afraid of love. Thank you, Luca, she said, her voice filled with gratitude.
Thank you for telling me.
He nodded, his eyes shining with unshed tears. I want you both to be happy, he whispered. I believe you can heal him. I believe you can save him. He turned and left, leaving Alessandra alone with her thoughts, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion, of understanding, of hope. She had seen a glimpse of Dario's past, a glimpse of the pain that had shaped him, the fear that controlled him. She knew, now, that her task was not simply to escape him, but to reach him, to break through his defenses, to heal his wounds, to show him that love was not a weakness, but a strength. It was a daunting task, a dangerous dance with a man who had vowed never to love again. But Alessandra was no longer the naive, innocent girl who had been brought to this house as a captive. She was a woman who had faced her fears, who had learned to fight, who had discovered the power of love. She would not give up. She would not be defeated. She would fight for Dario, for their future, for the possibility of a love that could heal them both. She would use her understanding, her compassion, her strength, to break through his walls, to reach the man beneath the mask, to show him that even in the darkest of worlds, love could still bloom. She resolved to speak to him, to confront him with this new knowledge, to force him to face his past, and perhaps, together, they could forge a future. The dance with danger had taken on a new dimension, a new purpose, and she was ready to lead. Chapter 15. The cracks in the foundation. Armed with Luca's revelation, Alessandra felt a shift in her resolve. It wasn't just about escape anymore, it was about reaching the wounded soul beneath Dario's hardened exterior. She knew the conversation would be difficult, potentially explosive, but she was prepared to face his demons, their demons, head-on. She found Dario in his study, the room dimly lit, a half-empty glass of whiskey on his desk. He looked up as she entered, his expression guarded, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and longing. Alessandra, he said, his voice rough. What is it? She closed the door behind her, ensuring their privacy. We need to talk, Dario, she said, her voice firm but gentle. About Isabella. His body stiffened, his face turning pale. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The name, a ghost from his past, had clearly struck a nerve. There's nothing to talk about, he said, his voice a low, strained murmur. There's everything to talk about, she countered, stepping closer. Luca, he told me. He told me what happened. He closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. Luca, he shouldn't have, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He did it because he cares about you, Dario, she said softly. Because he wants you to be happy. He opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on a distant point, as if lost in the memory of his past. Happiness is not for me, Alessandra, he said, his voice filled with a bitter resignation. I don't deserve it. Don't say that, she pleaded, her voice filled with compassion. You deserve to be happy, Dario. You deserve to love and be loved. She reached out and gently touched his arm, her touch a silent offer of comfort, of understanding. He flinched slightly, as if her touch burned him, but he didn't pull away. She was everything to me, he said, his voice choked with emotion. My light, my hope, my future. He paused, his breath catching in his throat. And I lost her. Because of who I am. Because of this life. It wasn't your fault, Dario, she said, her voice firm. It was a tragedy. A terrible, senseless tragedy. I should have protected her, he said, his voice filled with self-loathing. I should have kept her safe.
You couldn't have known, she said softly.
You couldn't have prevented it. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a raw, desperate pain. I vowed never to love again, he confessed. Never to be vulnerable again. Never to risk losing someone else. But you do love me, Dario, she said, her voice a gentle plea. You said so yourself. He closed his eyes again, his body trembling with the force of his emotions. I do, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But I'm afraid. Afraid of hurting you. Afraid of losing you. Alessandra stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him, holding him tight. You won't lose me, Dario, she said, her voice filled with conviction. I'm not Isabella.
I'm stronger.
And I'm not going anywhere. He buried his face in her hair, his body shaking with sobs. He clung to her, his grip desperate, as if she were his only lifeline, his only anchor in a turbulent sea. They stood there for a long time, locked in an embrace that was both healing and heartbreaking. Alessandra held him, offering comfort, offering solace, offering love. She let him cry, let him release the pent-up grief, the guilt, the fear that had haunted him for years. Finally, his sobs subsided, his body relaxing slightly. He pulled back, his eyes red and swollen, his face streaked with tears. I don't know what to do, Alessandra, he confessed, his voice a raw whisper. You don't have to do anything, she said softly. Just let me in. Let me love you. Let me help you heal. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. Can we really do this? He asked, his voice hesitant. Can we build a future together? We can try, Dario, she said, her voice filled with determination. We can try. She reached up and gently cupped his face, her thumbs wiping away his tears.
It won't be easy, she said.
But nothing worthwhile ever is. He leaned down and kissed her a slow, tender kiss that was filled with both passion and promise. It was a kiss that acknowledged the past, embraced the present, and dared to hope for a future. The cracks in the foundation of his carefully constructed world were beginning to show, and Alessandra was determined to widen them, to let the light in, to build a new foundation, one based on love, on trust, on honesty. The journey would be long and arduous, but for the first time, they were embarking on it together. Chapter 16. Flight of the Captive Heart. Despite the emotional breakthrough with Dario, Alessandra knew that staying within the Benedetti walls was a gilded cage, no matter how much love might bloom there. Dario's world was inherently dangerous, and his transformation, while promising, was still fragile. She needed to secure a future for them, a future free from the constant threat of violence and betrayal. She decided to reactivate her escape plan, but this time, with a crucial difference, she would take Dario with her. It was a monumental risk, one that could cost them both their lives if it failed. But she believed that Dario, stripped of his title and responsibilities, could finally find peace and redemption. She subtly began to gather resources, using the limited freedom her wife's status afforded her. She made discreet inquiries, rekindled old contacts from her previous life, contacts outside the mafia's reach. She needed money, false identities, and a safe passage out of the country. One afternoon, while Dario was away on business, Alessandra received a coded message from one of her contacts. A ship was leaving for South America in 3 days, and there were 2 places reserved for them. It was now or never. She packed a small bag, taking only the essentials, items that held sentimental value rather than monetary worth. She included a photograph of her mother, a small silver cross that had been a gift from her father, and a dried flower, a memento from the day she and Dario had visited the orphanage. She wrote a letter to Sofia, explaining her departure, thanking her for her kindness, and urging her to find a way out of the Benedetti household herself. She left the letter on Sofia's pillow, along with a small sum of money she had managed to save. Then she waited. Dario returned late that evening, his mood somber, his expression weary. He found Alessandra in the sitting room, her gaze fixed on the city lights below. "Alessandra," he said, his voice soft. "What's wrong?" She turned to face him, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The moment of truth. "We're leaving, Dario," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Tonight." His eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with suspicion.
"Leaving?"
He repeated.
"What are you talking about?"
"We're leaving this life," she explained. "Leaving the mafia. Leaving everything." He stepped closer, his gaze intense and searching. "You're running away?" he asked, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "We're running towards something," she corrected. "Towards a future. A future together. A future free." She held out her hand to him. "Come with me, Dario," she pleaded. "Let's start over. Let's be happy." He stared at her hand, his body trembling with indecision. He was torn between his duty, his loyalty, his fear, and the promise of a different life, a life with the woman he loved. I can't," he said, his voice a low, strained murmur. "I can't abandon my family. I can't abandon my responsibilities." "You're not abandoning them, Dario," she said, her voice firm. "You're choosing us. Choosing love. Choosing a future." She stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest, over his heart. "Listen to your heart, Dario," she pleaded. "Not your title. Not your fear." He closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. The internal battle raged within him, a war between his past and his future, between duty and desire. Finally, he opened his eyes, his gaze locking with hers. He saw the love, the hope, the determination in her eyes. And he knew that he couldn't refuse her. He began, then hesitated, his voice choked with emotion. Alessandra held her breath, waiting for his answer, her entire future hanging in the balance. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the decision. Then he nodded. "Yes," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "Yes, I'll go with you." Relief washed over her, a wave of joy that made her knees weak. He had chosen her. He had chosen love. He had chosen freedom. They left the estate under the cover of darkness, slipping away like shadows, leaving behind a world of power, of violence, of betrayal. They left behind a legacy, a family, a life they had both known. They were embarking on a journey into the unknown, a journey filled with uncertainty, with danger, with hope. As they drove away, Alessandra looked back at the imposing villa, its windows glowing with a warm, inviting light that belied the darkness within. She felt a pang of sadness, a sense of loss, but also a surge of exhilaration, of freedom, of love. She reached for Dario's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. He squeezed her hand, his touch a silent promise, a commitment, a vow. They were together, and that was all that mattered. They were fleeing, but they were also flying, soaring towards a new life, a new beginning, a new destiny. The flight of the captive heart had begun, and there was no turning back. Chapter 17. The Lion's Pursuit. Their escape was swift and silent, aided by Alessandra's meticulous planning and the network of contacts she had carefully cultivated. They drove through the night, leaving the city behind, heading towards the coast, towards the ship that would carry them to freedom. Dario remained quiet, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known, his family, his legacy, his power. He was stepping into the unknown, a world where his name, his title, his influence held no sway. Alessandra watched him, her heart aching for him. She knew that he was struggling, that he was questioning his decision, that he was battling his demons. But she also saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, a glimmer of excitement, a hint of relief. They reached the docks just before dawn, the air thick with the smell of salt and fish. The ship, a weathered freighter, loomed before them, its silhouette a dark promise against the lightening sky. Alessandra's contact, a grizzled old sailor with a network of connections spanning the globe, greeted them with a curt nod. "You ready?" he asked, his voice gruff. "Ready," Alessandra replied, her voice firm. Dario hesitated, his gaze fixed on the ship, his body trembling slightly. He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and trust. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alessandra took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she replied, her voice filled with conviction. He squeezed her hand, his touch a silent affirmation. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the leap of faith. They boarded the ship, disappearing into its depths, leaving behind the world they had known, embarking on a journey into the unknown. But their escape did not go unnoticed. Back at the Benedetti estate, the discovery of their disappearance sparked a furious uproar. Marco, enraged by his brother's betrayal, vowed to hunt them down, to bring them back, to make them pay. Donna Emilia, though heartbroken by her son's decision, understood his motives, her loyalty torn between her family and her heart. Marco, fueled by ambition and a thirst for revenge, mobilized his forces, using his connections within the mafia underworld to track Dario and Alessandra's movements. He was a relentless pursuer, a hunter determined to reclaim his prey. The news of Dario's defection spread like wildfire through the mafia community, causing shockwaves of disbelief and outrage. He was seen as a traitor, a weakling, a man who had abandoned his duty, his family, his honor. Sal DeMarco, seeing an opportunity to exploit the situation, offered his assistance to Marco, promising to help him track down Dario and Alessandra in exchange for a share of the Benedetti empire. He was a cunning strategist, a master manipulator, a man who always had his own agenda. The pursuit began, a desperate chase across continents, a deadly game of cat and mouse. Dario and Alessandra were on the run, constantly looking over their shoulders, knowing that their enemies were closing in. They were fugitives, hunted by the very world they had once belonged to. But they were not alone. They had each other. And they had love, a powerful force that gave them strength, that fueled their determination, that kept them going, even in the face of overwhelming odds. They knew that their journey would be long and arduous, that they would face many challenges, many dangers. But they were prepared to fight, to survive, to protect their newfound freedom, their newfound love. The lion was in pursuit, but the captive heart had taken flight, soaring towards a new horizon, a new destiny, a new hope. And they would not be caught. They would not be broken. They would not be defeated. They would face the challenges together, their bond strengthening with every mile they put between themselves and their past. The hunt was on, but so was the fight for their future. Chapter 18. Crossroads of Fate. The weeks that followed were a blur of close calls, narrow escapes, and constant movement. Dario and Alessandra traveled under assumed names, relying on Alessandra's network of contacts and their own resourcefulness to stay one step ahead of their pursuers. They moved from city to city, country to country, always looking over their shoulders, always aware of the danger that lurked in the shadows. Dario, stripped of his power and influence, adapted to his new life with surprising resilience. He learned to live simply, to rely on his own skills, to appreciate the small things he had once taken for granted. He discovered a strength within himself that he had never known he possessed, a strength born of love, of freedom, of necessity. Alessandra, in turn, blossomed in her newfound freedom. She shed the weight of her past, the burden of her captivity, the constraints of her former life. She became more confident, more assertive, more herself. Their love deepened, strengthened by the shared adversity, the constant threat, the unwavering commitment to each other. They found solace in each other's arms, comfort in each other's presence, hope in each other's eyes. But the pursuit continued, relentlessly. Marco, fueled by his vendetta and DeMarco's cunning manipulation, closed in on them, their enemies growing ever closer. One evening, while hiding in a small, secluded village in the Andes Mountains of South America, they received a coded message from one of Alessandra's contacts. Marco and DeMarco were on their way, closing in fast. They had to move, and they had to move quickly. They packed their meager belongings, preparing for another desperate flight. But this time, Dario had a different idea. "We can't keep running, Alessandra," he said, his voice firm. "We need to confront them. We need to end this." Alessandra looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. He was no longer the passive, conflicted man who had fled the Benedetti estate. He was a warrior, ready to fight for his freedom, for his love, for his future. "What will you propose?" she asked, her voice hesitant. He outlined a plan, a daring and dangerous gamble that could either secure their freedom or lead to their capture, even their deaths. He would use his knowledge of the mafia underworld, his understanding of Marco and DeMarco's tactics, to lure them into a trap, to turn the tables on their pursuers. Alessandra agreed, trusting in his judgment, in his strength, in his love. They prepared for the confrontation, knowing that their lives, their future, hung in the balance. They chose a remote location, a deserted mining town high in the mountains, a place where they could control the terrain, where they could use the environment to their advantage. They set their trap, carefully laying their plans, waiting for their enemies to arrive. As night fell, Marco and DeMarco, accompanied by a small army of armed men, arrived at the mining town. They were confident, arrogant, believing that they had finally cornered their prey. But they had underestimated Dario. They had underestimated Alessandra. They had underestimated the power of love. The confrontation was swift and brutal, a fierce battle fought in the shadows of the abandoned mines, the echoes of gunfire and shouts reverberating through the mountains. Dario, using his knowledge of the terrain and his tactical skills, outmaneuvered his pursuers, turning their own weapons against them. Alessandra, armed with a small pistol and a fierce determination, fought alongside him, her courage fueled by her love, her freedom, her desperation. The battle raged, a desperate struggle for survival, a clash between two worlds, a confrontation between past and future. As the dust settled, the outcome remained uncertain. The crossroads of fate had been reached, and the path ahead was shrouded in darkness. The final confrontation was imminent, and the price of freedom, the price of love, would soon be paid. One way or another, their journey would reach its conclusion. Chapter 19. Redemption in the Ruins. The battle reached its climax in the heart of the abandoned mine, a labyrinth of tunnels and shafts, a fitting metaphor for the tangled web of their lives. Dario, separated from Alessandra, found himself face to face with Marco, his brother, his enemy, his reflection. "Dario," Marco sneered, his voice echoing through the darkness. "You betrayed us. You abandoned your family. You chose her over us." "I chose love, Marco," Dario replied, his voice firm. "Something you wouldn't understand. Love," Marco scoffed. "Love is a weakness. A liability. You've become soft. And you've become a monster," Dario countered, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and pity.
Consumed by ambition.
Blinded by hate. They circled each other, two wolves locked in a deadly dance, their weapons raised, their gazes locked. The air crackled with tension, with animosity, with regret. "It didn't have to be this way, Marco," Dario said, his voice laced with sorrow. "We could have been brothers." "We were brothers," Marco retorted, his voice filled with bitterness. "Until you betrayed us." He lunged, his knife flashing in the darkness. Dario parried, the steel of their blades clashing, the sound echoing through the mine. They fought, a desperate struggle for survival, a battle between two brothers, two worlds, two destinies. Meanwhile, Alessandra found herself confronted by DeMarco, the cunning strategist, the master manipulator, the serpent who had poisoned their lives. Well, Signorina," DeMarco said, his voice a smooth, seductive murmur. "It seems your little game is over." "It's not a game, DeMarco," Alessandra replied, her voice cold and resolute. "It's life. And you're a parasite, a leech, feeding on the misery of others." He chuckled softly. "Such harsh words, Signorina," he said. "But I admire your spirit. You're a worthy opponent." "I'm not your opponent, DeMarco," she said. "I'm your end." He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, Alessandra acted, her movements swift and decisive. She disarmed him, her pistol pressed against his temple. "It's over, DeMarco," she said, her voice unwavering. He stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and fear. He had underestimated her, just as he had underestimated Dario. He had underestimated the power of love. Back in the depths of the mine, Dario finally disarmed Marco, his brother collapsing to the ground, defeated and broken. Dario stood over him, his weapon pointed at his heart. "I could kill you, Marco," Dario said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I won't. I'm not like you." He lowered his weapon, offering his hand to his brother. "Let's end this, Marco," he said. "Let's find a way to forgive each other." Marco looked at his brother's outstretched hand, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and hope. He hesitated, then slowly reached out and took Dario's hand. Dario pulled him to his feet, their embrace a tentative truce, a fragile reconciliation, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The battle was over. The ruins of the mine, a symbol of their past, had become the scene of their redemption. Dario had faced his demons, confronted his enemies, and chosen love over hate, forgiveness over revenge. Alessandra and Dario reunited, their embrace a testament to their survival, their love, their future. DeMarco was handed over to the authorities, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. Marco, humbled and remorseful, agreed to leave them in peace, to start a new life, away from the mafia, away from the violence, away from the past. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Dario and Alessandra emerged, scarred but not broken, their love stronger than ever. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, their hearts redeemed, their future secured. The ruins had given way to a new beginning, a new hope, a new love. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. The echoes of the confrontation faded, leaving behind a fragile peace, a tentative calm. Dario and Alessandra, with Marco's reluctant agreement to leave them be, began to rebuild their lives, far from the shadow of the Benedetti Empire. They settled in a small, remote village nestled in the Andes, a place where their past held no sway, where they could be simply Dario and Alessandra. But the past, like a persistent shadow, had a way of catching up. News arrived, fragmented and distorted, of turmoil within the Benedetti family. Donna Emilia, heartbroken by Dario's departure and Marco's subsequent exile, had fallen ill. Her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and her last wish was to see her son, Dario, one last time. Dario was torn. Returning to Italy meant risking everything they had fought for, exposing themselves to the lingering threat of their enemies, reopening old wounds. But he couldn't ignore his mother's plea, the call of family, the weight of his conscience. Alessandra, seeing the conflict in his eyes, understood his dilemma. She knew that he had to go, that he had to face his past one final time. "Go, Dario," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Go to your mother. I'll be here, waiting for you." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and love. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "I'm sure," she replied, her voice unwavering.
Go.
Make peace with your past. And then come back to me. He kissed her a long, tender kiss that was both a farewell and a promise. Then he left, embarking on a journey back to the world he had once ruled, the world he had abandoned, the world that still held a claim on his heart. Alessandra remained in the village, her days filled with a mixture of anxiety and hope. She busied herself with the simple routines of their new life, finding solace in the quiet beauty of the mountains, in the warmth of the local community, in the memory of Dario's love. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no word from Dario. Alessandra's anxiety grew, her fears amplified by the silence, by the uncertainty, by the unknown. Then, one evening, as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the mountains, she saw a figure approaching the village, a familiar silhouette against a fiery sky. Her heart leaped with joy, with relief, with love. It was Dario. He was walking towards her, his steps slow but determined, his face weary but at peace. He had faced his past, confronted his demons, and survived. They met in the center of the village, their embrace a silent reunion, a wordless expression of love, of relief, of belonging. "Mother?" Alessandra asked, her voice hesitant, fearing the worst. Dario nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. "She's gone," he said softly. "But she was at peace. She forgave me. She blessed our union." Alessandra held him tight, offering comfort, offering solace, offering love. She knew that his mother's death was a heavy burden, a loss that would always be with him. But she also knew that he had found closure, that he had made peace with his past, that he was free. What about the family?" she asked, her voice curious. "He's taken over," Dario replied. "He's a good man. He'll lead them in a new direction. Away from the violence. Away from the darkness." He looked at Alessandra, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "I'm free, Alessandra," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Free to be with you. Free to live our life." They stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun, two souls who had found each other in the midst of chaos, who had survived the storm, who had emerged stronger, wiser, more in love. The final confrontation had taken place, not on a battlefield, but in the hearts of those involved. Loyalties had been tested, choices had been made, and love, in the end, had triumphed. They turned and walked towards their small home, hand in hand, their steps light, their hearts full, their future bright. The captive heart had found its freedom, not in escape, but in redemption, in forgiveness, in love. The final confrontation was over, and their new life, their true life, had finally begun. Epilogue. Years passed, painting the canvas of their lives with the soft hues of contentment and the vibrant strokes of enduring love. Dario and Alessandra remained in the small Andean village, their lives a tapestry woven with simplicity, peace, and a profound connection to the land and its people. Dario, once the feared capo of the Benedetti family, became a respected member of the community, known for his quiet strength, his unwavering integrity, and his gentle wisdom. He worked the land, his hands, once accustomed to the cold steel of weapons, now finding solace in the warmth of the earth. He had found redemption, not in power or wealth, but in the simple act of living, of loving, of being. Alessandra, once the captive bride, blossomed into a woman of grace, resilience, and unwavering spirit. She became a pillar of the community, a teacher, a healer, a friend. She embraced her new life with a passion and a joy that radiated outward, touching everyone she encountered. They had children, 2 boys and a girl, who grew up surrounded by the beauty of the mountains, the warmth of their family, and the enduring power of their parents' love. The children knew nothing of their parents' past, of the darkness they had escaped, of the dangers they had faced. They only knew the love, the peace, the security of their home. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the mountains, Dario and Alessandra sat on the porch of their small home, watching their grandchildren play in the fields below. They were old now, their hair silvered, their faces lined with the passage of time, but their love, their connection, remained as strong as ever. Dario reached for Alessandra's hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, their touch a familiar comfort, a silent language of love. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that transcended words. "We made it, Cara," he said softly, his voice a low, gentle murmur. "We found our paradise." Alessandra smiled, her heart overflowing with love, with gratitude, with peace. "Yes, my love," she replied. "We did." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her body nestled against his, their 2 souls intertwined, inseparable, eternal. They had faced the darkness, conquered their demons, and found their way to a life of simple beauty, of profound love, of enduring peace. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with vibrant colors of orange, pink, and purple. The mountains stood silent witness to their enduring love, a testament to the power of redemption, of forgiveness, of hope. They had found their happily ever after, not in a palace of gold, but in a humble home nestled in the heart of the Andes, surrounded by the beauty of nature, the warmth of family, and the enduring power of love. The captive heart had not only found freedom, but had also created a legacy of love, resilience, and a testament to the enduring human spirit. Their journey had ended, but their love story, a timeless tale of tea,